Mr Chair.
I call Grant Robertson.
Thank you, Mr Chair. It's fantastic to be present in the House for Maggie Barry to break the habit of a lifetime and not go into petty politics. So it's a moment that I will truly remember for many years. It will never happen again. That's right. So I'm delighted to have made my way to the House to hear that beautiful moment, Mr Chair. It's a pleasure to take a call on part 3 of this bill. As somebody who's been a public servant here in Wellington and represented public servants as the MP for Wellington Central and also as a former spokesperson on state services, there is, I want to say, a lot in this bill to be very happy about. This is a bill that I know has had some concerns raised and they've been worked through in the Select Committee, but the idea, the principles that lie behind this bill of trying to create a more responsive, more integrated state sector that can be more flexible and responsive to the needs of our communities is a goal that I do think is shared across the House, and I want to say that from this side of the House there are things in this bill that we genuinely believe will be very helpful to those overall principles. If we refer specifically to part 3, I want to make a couple of comments. The first of those is around the question of whole of government directions. This is what's covered by clause 162 of the bill, and in this case we're talking specifically about Crown entities and the ability of the Minister of State Services and the Minister of Finance to jointly direct Crown entities to support a whole of government approach. This is a very good clause in my view, Mr Chair, because one of the things that anybody working both inside government but also working with government agencies and Crown entities, the criticism that is so often directed is that there is a silo mentality. And all of us will have in our lives have interacted with a government agency who say, quite simply, I cannot help you because that is not my responsibility. Now that's something that members of the public struggle to understand. Members of the public don't wake up in the morning and think, today I'm going to deal with the Ministry of Social Development, followed by Inland Revenue, followed by that. They think about the government. They think about the government acting as a single entity, and for people who use the services of the government to have to interact and have to come up against those silos, they are frustrated. We need to be able to create a public sector and a wider state sector that actually meets the needs of those individuals and communities. But as politicians and as public servants, there is a whole other level of frustration that is created. And I can remember as a staff member in the Prime Minister's office having to come up with creative ways of trying to get the public sector to work together. And the innovative idea, and anyone who's been was in the public sector in the first decade of the 2000s will quake with fear at the phrases economic transformation, families young and old, and national identity. And I had 3 little boxes on my desk in the Prime Minister's office with information on each of those. And we did actually sit down and say, how are we going to get the public service to work together on the priorities of the government? And it doesn't matter if it's a national-led government or a Labour-led government, whatever the government's priorities are, how do we shift the ship of state to support the things that the government wants to do? For instance, that may well be one of the turbocharging and finding a brighter future. Well, unfortunately, I think the ship at this very moment the ship's run aground, so that's not even a concern. But if we generalise it, enabling the government agencies to get out of the silos, we took that approach with those three themes were what we chose to do that, and we actually went as far as saying budget bids had to come through one of those 3 themes, and they were consolidated. Now that actually cuts against the Public Finance Act, and some of the amendments in this bill start to deal with the problem that was underlying that. And the problem was that each public service chief executive, through their statement of intent, had set themselves up in an agreement with the minister, and that was it. They were the apex of everything. And the amount of money that they could share between agencies was severely restricted and severely limited, and in many ways actively discouraged. So the fact that this bill is putting in place some mechanisms that will break up some of those silos is a very good thing. Richard Norman, who's an academic at the Victoria University, talks about the fact that the State Sector Act and the Public Finance Act, written as they were in the late 1980s, are products of a time which he says was the time, Mr Chair?
Grant Robertson.
Which he says were the time of the spreadsheet. So in other words, it was all about rows and columns, and if you added it all up at the end of the day, you would come up with the answer that you need. We now live, as Richard Norman would say, in the age of Google, when it's actually all about the networks and the connections between issues rather than setting up artificial barriers. At the moment, the structure of our state sector lives in the age of the spreadsheet. And we do need to move it into the age of Google, where we focus on the networks, we focus on the connections between the issues that face our communities. This bill, and in fact Part 3 in terms of Crown entities, does go some way towards doing that. The idea of whole-of-government directions is a useful way of going about that. But I would venture to suggest, Mr Chair, that actually we could go much further. We could go much further to saying, what are the problems that we want the public sector and the state sector to address? What are the structures that best address those problems? And then work on it that way. At the moment, form is still leading function. And if the state sector is going to deliver to the needs of New Zealanders, function needs to get out in front. And at the moment, we still struggle with that inside the state sector. This bill does good things to move us in the direction of breaking down those silos, but it fails, in my view, to go as far as it might. I want to briefly, Mr Chair, just in the time remaining to me, talk a little bit about the question of statements of intent, and I know my colleague David Cunliffe was speaking about this at some length earlier on. All of us, both former ministers, current ministers, people who've been public servants, are aware that there is a danger in the statement of intent process that it simply becomes a box-ticking, form-filling type exercise. Again, there are good things in this part. Well, John Hayes and I both worked for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and we know a good deal about form-filling and box-ticking. Actually, Mr Hayes, to his credit, was never very interested in form-filling or box-ticking at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. As somebody who occasionally had to go around the Pacific in the wake of Mr Hayes, I can say that he was much more focused on function than form and outcomes at that point, and that is to his credit. That's right. Although the wake was sometimes quite large, and I'm not referring to size at all here, I'm just referring to the impact of Mr Hayes arriving in a community. But he was focused on the outcomes, and I think the statement of intent does run the risk of being less about the outcomes and more about the process. And I think there are some things in this part that do go to that. The note of caution that's already been raised is the fact that what the statement of intent process usefully does is open up to the rest of us what's going on and what the priorities are. If we can get that process right, the development of those statements of intent right, then I think we'll go a long way towards actually having a meaningful document. Again, a big part of that is ensuring that the statement of intent, when it's drafted and created, takes into account the views of other relevant entities and agencies. And we've all had that feedback about the 10 cars in the driveway. When you've got the family with the complex and messy and difficult problems, and you arrive along and there are the 10 cars in the driveway from the 10 government agencies, and do SIFs know what the police have done, and do the Ministry of Education know what work and income are doing, or what the school's doing, indeed. And we all know that those are difficult problems, but if we take that all the way back to the statements of intent of those agencies, until the agencies are talking to one another in the creation of those documents, and are creating those documents on the basis of the issues and the outcomes that we want, that's what will get us there. If we start at that point, we'll get a good outcome. If we start at the point of, here is our formulaic statement of intent, which we must produce on our own and we must look good about, then we won't get anywhere. So, Mr Chair, what I'm saying here is that Part 3 of this bill, I believe, does offer us some positive ways forward for creating a more integrated, more responsive state sector. I believe we could go significantly further in that. I encourage the government to adopt a cross-party approach to find a way in which we can focus on the outcomes of the state sector, the way in which it serves our communities, and break down the silos. If we do that, Mr Chair, I believe that we will be proud of our efforts, but I do believe in Part 3 there are some good measures that we can and should all support.
The Honourable Leanne Dalzell.
Chairman, I couldn't agree more with my colleague.